What's going on, folks? Running it back with our final part of our roster breakdown for Khorne here. We'll jump right into it. We've got a lot of units to go through here. It's one of the larger sections on the roster. One that doesn't get tremendous amounts of attention. I do think that this is probably where we're going to see the wildest variance between what units I believe are worth bringing and the ones that are just utter trash and can't really get a whole lot done. Bringing them is definitely something that you should treat with some skepticism as to whether it's going to actually help you in accomplishing something productive or not. With that in mind, we'll jump in and we'll start with the simple Warhound here, which is a fairly reasonable unit, very similar to Furies. They're 200 gold cheaper. Flipping over, we can get into the nitty-gritty of them. 25 armor, 6,000 health, 80 models, pretty low mass, terrible leadership at 38. These things do tend to run away pretty quickly. You compare them to, like the Skaven Wolf Rats, and they're not much better. Skaven Wolf Rats have some benefits over the Khorne Hounds as well. Particularly the fact that there's poison and AP and magical damage available to either of the variants. They do tend to be a little bit more powerful than the Khorne Warhounds because of that. Terrible melee defense of 12. You do have Frenzy, but the Frenzy is going to be active only when these guys are at full health and they get a full charge off. The melee attack's really not that great with Frenzy active either. I mean, 36 is fine. It's not atrocious, but it's definitely outclassed by the Furies overall. The big thing that these guys have that Furies don't is cap weight, obviously. They're very good at running in and getting into your opponent's backfield, maybe shutting down a ranged unit if you get the right kind of jump off on them, and then running over to cap up a point and putting a lot of pressure on your opponent that way. That's really what these Warhounds are good at. They have Striders, so they can run up into trees and they can escape really nicely, as well as also moving through aquatics terrain efficiently. Not that that's really like a big thing in Dom. There's only a handful of maps that have any kind of water terrain features to speak of. Most of them aren't played in competitive tournaments anyways. I don't know. They're fine. They're fine for exactly what I said. It's really just cap weight, though, that they're used for. If you're trying to rely on them as a damage tool, you've just got better stuff on the roster for that. But in a pinch, as mobile cap weight and potentially getting a really good uptrade into a squishy ranged target, I think that you can make them work. Like Wood Elves, High Elves, Dark Elves not so much. Dark Elves just have way too much mobility that can flatten these guys like Dark Riders and stuff. Not to say that Wood Elves don't also, but if you get a Hound on top of a Swift Shiver Shard, Deepwood Scout or something, which are very common, or goodness gracious, imagine a Warhound getting on top of a Waywatcher. That is crazy value. These guys do have good damage output against low armor, so those squishy factions need to be very careful of you diving into their backfields with these guys. That's what keeps them up here in the B tier, rather than being a little bit lower down, in my opinion. So, getting into Furies. Furies are an S tier unit. They are amazing. They are very similar in class to your Marauder Horsemen with throwing axes in some sense. Obviously, very different roles. Marauder Horsemen with the throwing axes are very good at controlling large targets, as well as also chasing off routing units. Occasionally hammering into the front line if they have an opportune moment. Furies, though, are very much your dive tool. They are specifically built so that you can just fly them overhead, drop down on top of your opponent's ranged pieces, or onto the rear of infantry fights and just absolutely open up all of the opportunities for you to break through and maximize the mayhem that Khorne is so good at achieving on the battlefield. Provided, of course, you're using your units appropriately. So, getting into their stats, 5200 HP on 60 models, a little squishy on the HP front. They have gotten a lot of buffs over time. I think they got an HP buff, and then they I know they got more leadership, because their leadership was, I think, 40 at one point. Ever since the Furies got buffed up to 50 leadership, they have been much stronger. Some people considered them OP at one point. Some people might even still think that they're a little over strong. But that squishy HP pool with low armor means that they get wrecked pretty quickly, and with 50 leadership, they'll crumble out horrendously fast. So you have to be very careful with your Fury dives, because, like I said, low armor, low leadership, low HP, very weak melee defense. It's the damage output where they really shine through, and what makes this unit so strong. Good weapon strength of 44, honestly. I mean, when you compare them, they're really not that far off from a Forsaken. In fact, they have better stats, period, in terms of the melee attack and melee defense. Charge bonus and weapon strength are a little lower, but just the fact that these guys have 110 speed and they can fly overhead of your opponent's front line while they're engaged, and you get free access to the backfield, is incredible stuff. And if you get these guys on target in the right situation, up trades all day, every day with that melee attack, man. And, you know, since they've got 50 leadership, that Frenzy is going to be active pretty consistently as long as you're getting charges off. It is worth remembering that units that are charging do get a boost to their leadership. Kind of like a little morale boost, I guess, since they're going in. Very much an Unga Bunga unit. Don't ever discount the mayhem that Furies can cause. Not that many people do, but if you haven't had the unfortunate pleasure of being ripped to pieces by Fury swarms, keep an eye out and know how to counter these guys. Basically, just countercharging them when they land is the best way to kill a Fury unit. There's really not much else to say about them. They're just damn solid, and they give you a lot of options on the battlefield for what you can do. Even just having them out and flying overhead and threatening your opponent can oftentimes stress their micro, because then they end up positioning their units to try and counter a Fury dive onto their range tools. Then you get into the front line. It can be a little hard for your opponent to re-engage their units into the right position to countercharge them at that point. You need to make sure to use these guys to force your opponent's units out of position to maximize their value. There's a lot of little things like that that can really help Fury shine. Moving on from them, we've got Fleshhounds. Fleshhounds are a great unit. In the past, would have probably belonged up here with the Furies, but I do think that there are some vulnerabilities to these guys that really can't be ignored. Not to say that they aren't damn strong, which is why they are where they are. Biggest issue with them being, again, they don't have tons of HP. They've got 6,000 HP on 32 models, which is pretty juicy. They've got good mass as well. Very good at locking single entities in place, especially horse characters. If a Fleshhound unit surrounds a horse character, particularly like a lightly armored caster or something, they absolutely delete those units because they have crazy good weapon strength. Even having decent armor-piercing values on them, as you can see there. 36 melee attack is pretty solid. 60 leadership. They don't have Frenzy, unfortunately. That would really help their DPS, but I think they would be busted at that point. These guys are like a shock unit, essentially. Either that or a little bit of mobile mass to peel your units out of trouble. Like one of the better combos with Fleshhounds. You run them in Valkia is trapped up in some skirmish cav or something like that. Your opponent's trying to blob her down. You send the Flesh Hounds in, maybe with some Fury support, followed up by some Blood Beast or something, to go and try and peel all of that off of her. The Flesh Hounds are the best unit to engage with first, just because they have a solid charge bonus. Getting that weapon strength online with the good melee attack means that they absolutely pound lightly armored cavalry units on the flanks whenever they get a good charge off. With 95 speed, they're super maneuverable, so it's very easy to get them out of bad positions, provided your opponent doesn't have nets or anything to CC them in place. Anything that can like slow them horrendously is usually going to be a death knell for these guys, because if they get caught and countercharged with their 30 armor, they are going to go down really quick, and 60 leadership is okay. But with demonic instability being as punishing as it is, they get caught out at half health and they get rear charged, they're going to crumble out and you're going to lose a ton of value on these guys. So keep that in mind. They do cause fear. They got Vanguard deployment. They can hide. Physical resist is nice on them. Helps keep them alive in some otherwise bad fights. And the spell resistance is 50% on these guys. One of the rare instances of a Khorne unit getting that extra little bit. Makes them very hard to shut down with Melkoths or Bunas. Spells that would otherwise be perfect for taking a unit down like this. Not quite as good. You'll still see people use spells on these guys, particularly ones that affect leadership, and like I said, slows and stuff like that, that don't care about the spell res. It'd be nice to see spell resistance get worked with a little bit, so that Khorne fully benefits from the mitigation of magic. I don't know, that's just my personal opinion, though. It's a little silly that damage spells are the only thing affected, but debuffs, don't really care about this. It's really how you shut down Flesh Hounds, is debuff spells and hammering home with your own shock units, whether that's cavalry or you've got your own category of monsters that can do it. That's usually your best bet against the fleshies. Hounds of the Blood Hunt, A-tier unit. They're a straight upgrade over your standard Flesh Hound. They're 1,000 gold. So they're 250 more for a decently better unit, we would say. It is very strong, don't get me wrong. You can see here the comparison. A straight upgrade on leadership, melee attack, and melee defense, making them pretty decent prolonged combatants. These guys can do some heavy lifting that a regular Flesh Hound can't. A lot of that is thanks to the Gore Feast ability that they have. A 0.10 heal per second in melee combat definitely gives these guys a little bit of extra sustainability. Couple that with the fact that they remove magical attacks makes them very good again in all of the demon matchups. Almost an auto-include against Nurgle, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, factions of that nature. These guys avoid the worst of it from their opponents, and then they also just hammer home. Like I said, for all of the same reasons that a regular Flesh Hound does, these guys are a little better, plus being immune to contact effects, which is something that you really can't overestimate. Immunity to poison and any imbued contact things like Dazed, or what are some other ones? The Mordheim Beowulfs have a contact effect that mitigates healing, but it doesn't work on the Hounds of the Blood Hunt. So, most units would lose Gore Feast if they were getting attacked by the Mordheim Beowulfs, but Hounds of the Blood Hunt do not, since they don't care about the imbuements that their opponent is trying to put on them. Overall, a very solid unit. Gotta use these guys sparingly. You don't want to overextend with them. Just because they have Gore Feast doesn't make them invincible. Please don't get the wrong impression of these guys. It's just a slightly better Flesh Hound. It's one of the more balanced RORs in the game, which is why it's still on the same tier as the standard variant of Flesh Hound. If you try to use these guys like there's some super uber elite unit, you're going to be very disappointed by the fact that your opponent just absolutely smacked them down. Still weak to shop cav, so keep them back, chase units off the field, or harry the edges of a fight. Dive range targets, stuff like that with flesh hounds is how you really want to use them, and these guys are the exact same, just a little bit better. They'll hang around on the field a little bit longer than your standard variant. It might take them a little longer to get their gold value back, but they will draw a little more attention, so you can use them to suck micro away from your opponent oftentimes, which is really damn strong. Stressing your opponent out is the ultimate tactic. You know, strike where your opponent isn't, and if your opponent is of choleric temperament, irritate him. You know, good old Sun Tzu quotes for Total Warhammer competitive. Chaos Spawn are a situational niche unit. They have good damage output. They're pretty decent, honestly. The worst thing about them is their speed. They've only got 42 speed here, as you can see, meaning that they struggle to get around the battlefield oftentimes. These guys are really good in matchups where your opponent's going to be trying to dominate the mobility game, and you're actually wanting to play a little more static, just because they're very good mass. They've got 1500 mass, big HP pool. Armor of 30 is better than the other spawn, but still really weak. So, gotta be careful of these guys getting shot down. Melee attack of 36. Really, it's 46 because Frenzy's always going to be active since they're unbreakable. Melee defense is 23. Good weapon strength. With the fact that you've always got Frenzy active on these guys, they hammer hard. They are a strong unit at chewing through lightly armored stuff, and in matchups like Vampire Counts, and a handful of others, honestly, I like mixing in one spawn every now and then into the Wood Elf matchup, just because of the flaming damage. They can mess up anything that's weak to fire pretty nicely. Norska's not terrible for these guys either. They're a little more vulnerable in that matchup just because Skinwolves hit so hard against them. Even though these guys can also give it back in return, and Armored Skinwolf trades into the spawn of Khorne pretty well. There's definitely ways to exploit these things. Mostly that's at range. You don't really want to lock horns with a spawn if you can help it, but if you do, just get a good surround on them, and poke them down with some cheap anti-large. With their weak melee defense, they go down pretty quickly to stuff like that. They cause fear, which isn't really that much, to be honest. It's okay. You know, -8 to leadership against units that they're fighting. You've got a lot of that on this entire board here for all the monsters, so it's really nothing that special. Spell resistance, of course, and really not much else to speak of. Pretty limited unit. Definitely something you can use on occasion, catch your opponent off guard. Slaanesh is another matchup where these spawn are pretty good, just because, you know, then they don't care about being leadership bombed by Slaanesh, or getting rampaged, because it's kind of hard to pull them out of position. A little bit easier to do to Blood Beasts and Minotaurs, who take a much bigger pounding than the spawn do, because the spawn at the very least aren't going to run. They'll at least get you some value back. That's really what the spawn are here for, is against factions where you're afraid that Minos or Blood Beasts are going to get caught out of position, or pulled out of position, and you just need something that can hold the line and stand next to your infantry and block up enemy cav or other monsters, and you need to guarantee some return on investment. That's really what these guys are about. That's how I think of them, at least, and I've had some success with that. Niche unit, definitely not something that's going to appear in a lot of matchups, but you can definitely make use out of them. Blood Beasts are an S tier unit. They hit hard as hell. Absolute crazy damage output right now. People thought they were kind of bad when they got released because of the weapon strength bug on all monstrous units. And a lot of people also looked at Blood Beasts and... where are they? Here they are. Here's the Skaven. They saw Blood Beasts and they were like, this is just a more expensive Rat Ogre. This is 400 gold more than a Rat Ogre. For all of that, are those extra stats really going to make that much of a difference? And, yes. Yes, the extra 400 gold that a Blood Beast costs as opposed to a Rat Ogre, very much worth it. These guys are crazy in melee combat. As long as you can maneuver them around and get them to utilize that 50 charge bonus that they've got, they will slap down just about anything. They are excellent at waiting behind until your infantry engage your opponent's front line. They run up through your infantry. They've got really good animations for flying into combat. They're like WWE wrestlers, or really more like the like really acrobatic, high-flying wrestling style in particular. And they just collapse positions like nobody's business. Excellent shock infantry, or monstrous infantry. Very good against SEs as well. With their animations, they hit really hard with the weapon strength, as well as staggering very nicely. They can keep up with a lot of SEs with the 65 speed. And the good mass keeps them locked in place, and they'll just pummel stuff, man. This is a brute force unit. Very, very aggressive tool that you want to use. The things that hold them back are their low armor and low melee defense. Got to be very careful about that, but they've got better leadership than the Minotaurs do. And they're much faster than Spawn. So any matchup where you're not needing this super heavy hitting anti-large or anti-infantry of the Minotaurs, and where you don't need the Spawn's durability and persistence on the field, and you just need something to just absolutely blow apart a front line and brutalize your opponent's aggro units, Blood Beasts are the answer. Their AP split isn't amazing, but they do have a majority AP at the least. Even without that extra armor-piercing damage that like the Minotaurs have, you can see here it's really not that far. It's not even that far off even. I mean, 77 versus 75. Is that really a downgrade? I mean, you straight up get more damage output no matter what. Just thanks to the extra base weapon damage. It takes about 130, 140 armor to start mitigating almost all base weapon damage. So against the majority of the targets they're going to be fighting, they're going to have perfectly acceptable damage output that the Minotaurs, even with Blood Greed, are going to have to like work on in order to build up to, so to speak. Can't go wrong with them. They're good in just about every matchup. There's a handful where they're a little bit less powerful, but I would still recommend them in large numbers. You know, like bringing 3 Blood Beasts can be very overwhelming for someone to deal with. Bringing 1 or 2 can be a little bit easier, but, you know, then they're a little bit more specialist, and you're probably trying to use them less in the tanking the frontline fights and probably more on the flanks at that point, where they can be supported by more mobility, because that's probably the style you're going with at that stage. If you're going with mass numbers, though, they're, like I said, really good for breaking up frontline positions. Once your infantry have engaged, they get in, crack leadership and HP, and party all night, man. Party time unit. War Shrine, pretty much unusable, in my opinion. I really don't even think it's worth talking about, honestly. There's a couple units like that. It's the first unit that I put in the D tier. There's no reason to bring a regular War Shrine. It's 1,300 gold, you're better off spending it elsewhere, and if you need a War Shrine, then you're probably bringing a Blood Speaker, or a cultist on a war shrine for some reason. Bloodspeaker's probably your best bet for a war shrine. Excuse me. The standard variant just isn't good. It's just not good. It's got Favor of the Ruinous Powers, which is great, but it's only got 60 leadership, so it's 70 leadership at base. It's pretty low. It's got terrible stats. It doesn't have a lot of damage output. It's okay at killing infantry, I guess. Not the worst thing in the world, but it just doesn't give a lot of benefit. Giver of Furious Glory is damn strong with the damage resistance that it imbues, but I still think that On the Bloodspeaker is a better option, because he's got all of the support tools in the world to increase the advantage of having this guy in a static position, while a standard War Shrine, it's just not going anywhere, and it's not like you can bring multiples of these things. You can only bring one in your army with the unit caps, as they are. So, if that's going to be the case, and it's going to stay that way, just spend the extra 700 gold and get your Lord attached to this guy, because you get Wild Abandon, Murderous Exhortations, Pilgrimage, Blood Sacrifice if you really want, and the Bloodspeaker on the Shrine is 800 gold more than the Chaos War Shrine, and he will get you better value for your money. He's already got better leadership at 70 at base, with the fact that he's going to buff his own leadership up with Favor. He ain't going nowhere. And he can heal himself with Blood Sacrifice, and the Blood Reaper combo actually can do some pretty good work for you. Pop Locust, and on 11,000 HP, you're going to net about 1,000 health back from using Blood Sacrifice on himself. That's if he's getting targeted down. If he's not, you can obviously use the combo on another unit, like the Bloodweight Berserkers, or your Minotaurs, or something like that. It's a cool little thing. That's really the only time that I would recommend a War Shrine. Otherwise, just avoid it. Terrible unit otherwise. Some of that's down to unit caps. Maybe it would be a little bit better if you could bring multiple War Shrines in your builds. The fact that you can't, though, as good as the Khorne War Shrine effect is, it's just in too small of a radius. It's only 35 meters. That's one objective that you have to sit on. And Khorne doesn't really love holding static points to begin with, so take it for what it's worth, which is nothing. Minotaurs with the dual weapons, I mean, I guess you could just put them both up in A tier. You don't see the Minotaur dual weapons too terribly often. There are people who do really love bringing them. They honestly probably are an A tier unit. Both variants. They're on the stronger end of the spectrum as well. Definitely a little bit stronger than Fleshhounds, I would say. We'll bring them up here. We can get into what they do so well. Very highly specialized damage output from each of these guys. Bonus versus infantry and bonus versus large for the dual weapon and great weapon respectively. The exact same stats outside of an extra little bit of charge bonus for the great weapons, which is cool. Definitely helps them against cavalry units, which is usually what Minotaurs of Khorne are killing. They're pretty good against SEs as well. You do have lots of good characters to go after SEs with, though. So, if you can use these guys to lock stuff in place and just pummel it to death, perfect. Otherwise, use them to help control the flanks, and use your throwing axes to kill the SEs instead. That's what I would recommend using Minotaurs for. They've got 56 speed, they get around the battlefield pretty quickly, decent leadership at 70, great armor at 70 for a unit of this type. Way better than the Beastman variant, which only has 35 armor. The Beastman variant does have extra leadership, though. It's a little bit of a give and take, but I do think that the armor is a little bit better in exchange for the 5 leadership. These guys are still going to hang in perfectly fine. You can pair them up with like a Blood Shrine, or just keep your Lord nearby as well if you're worried about their leadership breaking at any point, because little encourages for units on Khorne's roster can make a big difference between having Frenzy and not having it available. And having it up gives these guys 44 melee attack at base, not even including the benefits from Blood Greed that they're getting. Blood Greed is crazy strong, up to 16 extra melee attack, charge bonus up 15%, and armor piercing weapon damage up 20%. Damn strong effects at 200 kills is quite a bit to have to get to. But if you summon a Minotaur in a couple of times, oftentimes you can get Blood Greed active pretty quickly by the second life. And then they're just absolutely ripping through everything. Because if you add a full charge on Blood Greed into their melee attack here, it's 50 base with Frenzy. They get up to 60 melee attack, not even including their bonuses, which are substantial and really help their damage output against the appropriate targets. These guys are a nightmare if unattended, which is why people oftentimes are going to be skewing for them pretty hard. Maybe not as much now because Blood Beasts are so damn strong. But you really just can't underestimate the power that Minotaurs provide. If you go with a couple Minos in your build, it's still just as good as it once was. You know? Maybe just a tiny bit less cost effective than a Blood Beast Swarm. But the specialization these guys provide is definitely something you'll want every now and then in matchups. And there's really not a bad matchup for Minotaurs. I'm trying to think of one. Maybe Lizardmen, Dread Saurian, or Shredder of Lustria builds. Minotaurs aren't very good against because there's a whole host of reasons. Not going to get into all of them. It would take me forever to describe it. But long and short, you can bring a Minotaur and be very happy. Happy little clam. Especially when your opponent's got lots of low AP skirmishers. Minotaurs with their good armor values can survive a little bit better than the Blood Beasts, so it's worth keeping in mind for them. We get into the big monsters now, and there are some serious problems here for some of them. I'm going to get to them, obviously, and I'll talk about it, but none of these big monsters are all that good. Soul Grinder is probably the most usable of the bunch. That might sound crazy because I can't think of anybody who really brings these on a regular basis. I've played around with them a ton though, and I can tell you there's definitely things about this Soul Grinder that make it an absolute nightmare for people to have to contend with. Some of that just comes down to the fact that it's got 120 range on its shotgun cannon. It fires 3 projectiles every 5 seconds with great damage output. This missile strength is a little deceptive in some regards, just because it says 720. But you can see here, with the base missile damage, armor-piercing missile damage, and the number of projectiles, and the fact that it fires so quickly, it will chunk down infantry pretty damn fast, and it's not bad against cavalry either. Now, a Soul Cannon's a little bit more cost efficient if you're going to be using range tools a bunch, just because it's got better range and a little bit more output, as well as having heals in combat, but Soul Grinders do cause terror. So if you don't have a terror-causing Lord, and you're playing against a low leadership faction that you can skirmish with a little bit with the Soul Grinder, you can do some nasty work with this thing. It has great mass at 4,000. This is a little deceptive, partially because this thing has insane collision attacks. If you get it on the side of an infantry unit, fire your shotgun cannon into them, they're going to get their leadership debuffed for being attacked by artillery, because this thing technically counts as an artillery piece. Don't ask why. I don't know the answer. Only CA could tell you. But what you do, you get that shotgun cannon blast off. You kill about 20 models with that, because this shotgun cannon is devastating if it lands. enough to kill any infantry model easily. And it pierces through stuff, and with 3 projectiles, it's just an absolute nightmare. Side charge through them with the collision damage, you can get about 100 kills in this guy in about a minute flat. I'm not kidding. The Soul Grinder is great against tons of crappy infantry. It is a nightmare for opponents to try and take down because it's so disruptive. You just keep giving it attack orders. You don't have to worry about it not shooting while you're moving if you've got fire at will on, because it fires while it's moving. It doesn't have to sit and shoot. It can just roll around and be an absolute asshole of a unit. It's got great armor values at 90 with the physical resistance. Dedicated magical damage really is needed for this thing. Now, what holds it back? One is that it is 1750 gold. It's the same price as the Bloodweight Berserkers. Most of the time, you're going to prefer the Bloodweight Berserkers to the Soul Grinder. It's got very low melee defense. It can be a little squishy at times. 70 leadership isn't amazing either, but use this guy in tandem to cause disruption in the backfield of your opponent with Fury and Fleshhound dives and keep missiles away from shooting at it, and it's going to be able to have a field day. Just don't let it get... Excuse me, don't let it get caught in combat, and utilize that terror to maximum effect. Use it to clear infantry. Use it to shoot at enemy lords with its missile and chase them around. It's got great weapon strength to do this. Good charge bonus of 50. It's a very underrated monster, in my opinion. Decent HP pull at 8,100. Not insane, but certainly not terrible. I like it. I think it's underrated. I don't think it's usable in a ton of matchups, per se. Any faction with really strong missile play, or, good, like, cavalry that can lock it in place that you're going to have a little bit of a hard time peeling through, like Silver Helms and stuff. Make this guy a little bit of a risk in those kind of matchups. But in matchups with low leadership factions where this guy can harry units into oblivion, and then also with the 75 speed peel out and run away from the stuff that's trying to take it down, you can really mess with your opponent's momentum and game flow, which I think is what it's best at. Keep it in mind, try it out, see if you can get some good damage out of that thing. Slaughter Brute is not a terrible monster. I just don't know, man. For the 2,000 gold, you do get a pretty good beastie. I think I'll leave it in B tier because it can actually rip through enemy units pretty nicely. It's also really good for the sole reason that it's unbreakable as long as your lord is alive. So, we'll move over. We can talk about it. Runes of Binding. At base, it's only got 60 leadership, which is terrible. But thanks to this, as long as the lord is not killed, routed, or routing, you have magical attacks, unbreakable, and it doesn't rampage. So this is a very controllable big monster. It's got 66 speed. It's got 5,500 mass, so running through the front line and even through cavalry units not going to be an issue for this thing. And with its charge bonus and weapon strength, it's pretty comparable to like a Kemerian War Sphinx in terms of the damage output to the units around it, which is awesome. It's got a little bit of missile resistance baked in as well, something that I wish some of these other units out here had. We'll get to them. Very frustrating unit to see be so poor here, but the Slaughter Brute can actually do stuff. It's got good melee attack, does tire out, loses a lot of efficiency as he gets tired, but being unbreakable, at the very least, it's still going to be something that you can just maneuver around and use as a big beat stick and distraction tool. That's probably what it's best for. Opponents are going to have to commit some serious damage to try and take a Slaughter Brute down. And if your opponent's doing that, then you can use all your other cheap mobility to probably harass down the rest of the enemy army. And if you can keep the Slaughter Brute alive into the late game, even if it's only got about 2,000 HP, if you keep missile units from shooting it down at range at that point, you can just use it to just bully infantry or cavalry because it causes terror. It just absolutely deletes models with its weapon strength. 600 weapon strength is kind of wild. Not a lot of units are have as good of weapon strength as that. Not without some serious help and inflation. It's okay. It really is okay. It's just a little bit hard to maximize value on, and really experienced opponents are going to make sure to poke this thing down without overextending onto it and over-focusing it. But as a mix-up tool and a distraction, it can definitely get a little bit of work done. Bloodthirsters suck. There's really nothing else to say. I've tried to make use of them extensively. Maybe the ROR is arguably in C tier. We'll flip over and I'll talk about the problems with these things. You know, they've got 7,000 HP. They've got less than the Soul Grinder and the Slaughter Brute by a pretty substantial margin, on the, especially compared to the Slaughter Brute, which also has cap weight and is grounded, so Bloodthirster's already losing out on that front, just not being able to provide cap weight. They've got good leadership and good speed. Armor values are kind of low at 70. It's got physical resistance, no missile resistance, so it's pretty damn squishy to missiles, which is usually how these things are getting taken down anyways. That's usually the counter to SEs, is missiles in general. So the Phys Res is nice. Like, it does mitigate missiles in its own right. It's still just not good enough, and magical missiles are just gonna eat this thing for breakfast. Like, a magical missile hitting the Slaughter Brute is still getting mitigated by that missile resistance. Phys Res on a magical, or from magical damage missiles, get no benefit from this thing getting hammered by the enemy. Good in melee, but against multi-entity units like Minotaurs or like the Fireborn and stuff like that, these Bloodthirsters get absolutely munched on. They're a big model, very poor hitbox. Kind of the same deal with the Slaughter Brute. I forgot to mention that. These things are very honest hitboxes, so if your opponent piles in on combat around these things, they'll take some serious chip damage if you leave them in place. And the Bloodthirster's mass is only 4,000. You might think that's still pretty damn good, but for whatever reason, I feel like these guys just get slowed down so much when they land on the ground that they're not really able to make use of that 4,000 mass. So they end up getting stuck pretty easily, and you end up in really bad situations, whereas the Soul Grinder and the Slaughter Brute, their speed isn't anything crazy, but I'm pretty sure their grounded speed is much better than the Bloodthirster's grounded speed, because these guys do not have 95 speed on the ground. I think if they did, and they were more maneuverable, because they have terrible turn speed on these guys, I think they would be a much better unit. That would be a nice little change for CA to make. Just let these guys move around on the ground at 95 speed. Make them turn quicker, for God's sake, please. They're so unmaneuverable. And on that squishy HP, that's a death sentence. Like, they're actually good in combat, I can tell you. If they're fighting another big SC, they will actually do a lot of damage. Their bonus versus large is kind of crazy at 35. The flaming attacks and magical damage mean that they can get through Phys Res and also mitigate healing at the same time, so they're very, very powerful in that regard. It's just on a unit that's kind of bad and mediocre in all the other important areas. Also being a flying unit, sometimes they don't land and get their attacks online with the weird hovering deal. They can't catch anything in the air either, since aerial combat is so janky, which really sucks and is another thing that holds them back. There's just so many little things that make these units bad. Khorne's Bloody Fist is arguably usable because it's got 90 leadership, and it doesn't really crumble out of combat unless it's in a truly horrific situation. It's almost unbreakable with 90 leadership, so you can at least get it around the field. And it's got Gore Shell, which is only a 10% ward save. I would like to see this be 20% if it's within large enemy target range. That way it's got some extra resistances. And then I think it would be a pretty balanced unit still, while also having, you know, a little bit more of a niche. And you'd probably see a Bloodthirster every now and then. As it stands, though, they're just held back by all of those little problems that end up compounding onto being one gigantic cluster of an issue for these guys. They just get outclassed by all the other big monsters, and the big monsters aren't even all that good to begin with here. Slaughter Brute. Slaughter Brute is another B-tier unit. It's usable in some matchups. It's a tech piece against super big monsters, like, say, the Shredder of Lustria. Stuff like that. It can actually go toe-to-toe with them and do pretty well for itself. I'll flip over and we can talk about it some. Huge HP pool at 10,000. Lots of 8s in there. Khorne's number, obviously. I do love that they mixed that in on almost all of the units. There's an 8 somewhere in here. Like 68 leadership. Just cheesy little things like that. Lots of the HP pools have it somewhere in here. Anyways, back to what I was trying to talk about before I got distracted and went off on a tangent. Huge HP pool, crazy high mass at 6,500. Not many units with this good of mass. So this guy can push around the battlefield pretty nicely. Also has Strength from Flesh, which is a great heal. It did get nerfed. Went down from a 0.2 to a 0.15. Not that terrible, though. Doesn't imbue any extra weaknesses on this guy. It's just a damn solid tool to have out. It's got 90 leadership. What else had 90 leadership? Has 3,000 more HP. It's just a joke that the Khorne's Bloody Fist is so bad. Bloodbrute Behemoth just does all the same things. Also has cap weight. Has Terror, obviously, being a terrifying freaking unit. It is crazy good in combat. It also has Blood Greed, Frenzy. Hits like a truck, dude, with 520 weapon strength and a bonus versus large of 30 on 69 melee attack, which is pretty damn nice if you ask me. Good armor values at 70. What else had 70 armor? CA, please. Please, CA. It's basically just a giant magnet. You bring this monster if you're expecting your opponent to commit to other big SEs, where this thing can value trade against those. Because with the passive healing, it's very hard to kill this thing. There are factions that arguably straight up... Excuse me. Sorry about that, guys. There are arguably factions that straight up cannot kill this thing in melee combat. I've had games against Bretonia where they've just committed like everything but the kitchen sink onto the Bloodbrute Behemoth, trying to kill it. It just goes into melee combat and it out-heals the damage from Peasant Longbows. It kills Knights pretty well, even Grail Knights and stuff like that. Lewin is somebody who can put some damage in on this guy. But the Bloodbrute Behemoth can't be underestimated. It is probably objectively the strongest monster. The thing that holds it back from being super meta and usable is just the fact that it costs 25-50 gold. That is an insane amount of money to be paying for a big monster. And you got a couple in the fact that, you know, you got to bring your Lord. You bring your cheapest, most cost-efficient Lord Valkia. You got 4750 to work with in your starting army. So you're often going to be at a little bit of a disadvantage on cap weight if you bring this guy in. But still niche and still usable, especially against Shredder of Lestria. This is one of the only pieces that I've found that can go toe-to-toe with the Shredder and not just get absolutely, completely 110% bodied. It's got good damage output against it. It hits pretty consistently. You have to support it against the Shredder, of course. You gotta shut down Skink Skirmishers. You need to get a unit in to buffer damage as well for the Bloodbrute Behemoth, if you can. Because the Shredder is just such a ridiculous unit. You know, this thing is great. Long and the short, it's a great unit. It's just held back by the cost. It's very hard to get your value back with it, but if you can, and you counterpick your opponent with this thing appropriately, you can really reduce them to tears with how capable it is. It also has scaling damage, so it gets a little bit better damage output against targets that are already hurt. I'm not sure how much that bonuses. I haven't actually done any testing with that, but it is present, and it is decently substantial because you can notice it in games if you're paying attention, that units with about half health probably take about, I would estimate, like another like 10-15% extra damage from the scaling damage that it has. Couple that with the fact that it's got Blood Greed, which gives a 20% boost to AP damage. 20% boost of 400 is, you can do the math yourself, pretty damn good. And it's not bad against infantry either. It's got good collision attacks. If you get it to get the trample animation off, it can rack up like 50 good kills with a good side charge. So definitely worth knowing about this guy. There's a lot of little things that you can do to like maximize value out of units on the Khorne roster. That might be something that I start doing soon. Is little shorts where I talk about some of the techs on individual units, just to emphasize what they can and cannot do. Something I'll be looking into. Keep your eye out for them in the future. But as it stands right now, I think that's just about everything, man. I don't think there's much else to talk about here. It does look like I've gotten through all those units. I don't think I'm leaving anything out. Let me double check. But yeah, that's it. That's the full roster breakdown for you. If you've been coming in and checking these out, I appreciate it. Every little bit helps. And I'll catch you guys around on the next one. Till then, peace out, guys, and take care.